Blood on a diner floor is notoriously hard to scrub out. Harper knew this from experience, though usually it was just a busted lip from a rowdy drunk. She never expected the warm blood soaking into her cheap cotton apron to be the result of a coordinated gangland hit, or that the terrified 6-year-old girl sobbing into her chest was the sole heir to the most ruthless syndicate on the East Coast. In a matter of seconds, a mundane Tuesday double shift violently collided with the criminal underworld. Harper thought shielding a child was simply human instinct. She didn't know the act would bind her forever to a man who ruled the city's shadows. The neon sign of Mickey's Diner buzzed with a rhythmic, dying hum, casting a flickering red glow across the rain-slicked pavement of Wabash Avenue. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of miserable, bone-chilling Chicago night that kept decent folks indoors and brought the desperate out to seek shelter over bottomless cups of burnt coffee. Harper Evans leaned against the faux leather counter, a damp rag resting in her calloused hand. At 24, she looked 30, her eyes framed by the deep, bruised purple of chronic exhaustion. Between the crushing weight of $80,000 in medical debt left behind by her late mother's battle with pancreatic cancer and a predatory landlord who treated the heat in her Logan Square apartment as a mere suggestion, Harper worked 70 hours a week just to drown a little slower. The diner was mostly empty. In the far corner booth sat a trucker snoring gently into his crossed arms. And then there was booth number 4. A little girl no older than 6 sat swinging her legs off the edge of the vinyl seat, entirely engrossed in a vanilla milkshake and a coloring book. She wore a pristine powder blue velvet coat that probably cost more than Harper made in 3 months. Sitting across from her was a man built like a brick wall. He wore a sharp, tailored grey suit that bulged unnaturally at the left breast, a telltale sign of a concealed weapon. He wasn't her father. The body language was all wrong. He was rigid, his eyes constantly scanning the street outside the rain-streaked window. His jaw clenched so tightly, the muscles jumped. Harper picked up a fresh pot of decaf and walked over. "More coffee for you, sir?" she asked, keeping her voice low. The man barely glanced at her. "No, just the check. We need to move." "I'm not done with my flower," the little girl protested, looking up. Her eyes were a striking, piercing shade of steel grey, framed by dark curls. She offered Harper a gap-toothed smile. "Look, it's a blue rose." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Harper said softly, feeling a sudden strange ache in her chest. For a fleeting second, the diner, the debt, and the rain faded away. "What's your name?" "Lily," the girl chirped. "Lily coat on, now," the man commanded. His voice brooked no argument. He tossed a crisp $100 bill onto the table. "Keep the change." Harper reached for the bill. Her fingers had barely brushed the textured paper when the night exploded. It didn't sound like guns, not at first. It sounded like a massive sheet of canvas being ripped in half right next to her ear. The front window of the diner vanished in a blinding spray of tempered glass and twisted metal. The man in the suit reacted with terrifying speed, his hand flying to his jacket, but he was a fraction of a second too late. The first volley of bullets tore through the side of the booth. He jolted violently, a sickening spray of crimson painting the pale yellow wallpaper behind him, and collapsed forward over the table. Time seemed to fracture into excruciatingly slow, disjointed frames. Harper saw the black SUV idling in the street, the silhouettes of 3 men leaning out the windows, the flashes of muzzle fire lighting up the rain. She saw the trucker dive under a table screaming, and she saw Lily. The little girl was frozen, her milkshake spilling over her coloring book. Her eyes wide with a paralyzing, silent terror as her bodyguard slumped dead across the table. Harper didn't think. There was no conscious decision, no weighing of the risks, no heroic internal monologue. There was only a visceral, ancient instinct. She lunged. Harper threw her body over the table, grabbing Lily by the waist of her velvet coat, and dragged them both backward as the second wave of gunfire tore through the diner. They hit the greasy linoleum floor hard. Harper wrapped her body entirely around the small, trembling frame, curling into a tight ball behind the reinforced steel base of the counter. The noise was deafening, a physical pressure that beat against her eardrums. Bullets chewed through the pie display, raining pulverized cherry-filling shattered glass and splintered wood down upon them. Harper squeezed her eyes shut, pressing Lily's face firmly into her chest to muffle her screams. She felt a sharp, burning sting rip across her left shoulder, followed by the terrifying sensation of hot blood soaking into her shirt. But she didn't loosen her grip. "Shh, shh, I've got you. I've got you," Harper chanted, though she couldn't even hear her own voice over the roaring gunfire. She prayed to a god she hadn't spoken to in years, bargaining her own life for the tiny, trembling one beneath her. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the roaring stopped. Tires squealed against the wet asphalt, peeling away into the Chicago night. A suffocating silence descended on the diner, broken only by the hiss of a ruptured espresso machine, the gentle patter of rain coming through the non-existent front window, and the ragged, terrified sobbing of the little girl clutched in Harper's arms. Harper lay on the floor for what felt like hours, dust and powdered drywall settling over them like a macabre snowfall. Every muscle in her body was locked in a state of rigid tetanus. "Are you okay?" Harper managed to whisper, her throat raw with inhaled plaster. She loosened her grip just enough to look at Lily. The girl's face was smeared with dust and someone else's blood. Her eyes wide and traumatized, but she gave a tiny, jerky nod. "Tommy," she whispered, pointing a trembling finger toward the booth. Harper didn't look. She knew what was in the booth. "Don't look, Lily. Just look at me." Distant sirens began to wail, cutting through the damp night air. Within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of the Chicago Police Department washed over the ruined diner. Officers stormed in, shouting commands, their flashlights cutting through the smoky haze. Hands grabbed Harper, pulling her up, separating her from Lily. "No, my lady," Lily screamed, fighting against the paramedics, who tried to wrap a shock blanket around her. She reached out for Harper with frantic, bloody hands. "I'm right here," Harper called out, but a paramedic pushed her back into a chair. "Ma'am, you're bleeding. You need to sit still," the EMT ordered, ripping the sleeve of Harper's uniform to expose the vicious, bleeding gash on her shoulder, where a stray bullet had grazed her. The diner was a chaotic hive of police tape, flashing cameras and barking radios. Detectives were already bagging the $100 bill and examining the shredded booth. Harper sat numbly as the EMT bandaged her shoulder, the adrenaline draining from her system, to leave behind a hollow, freezing exhaustion. Then the atmosphere in the room abruptly shifted. The ambient noise of the crime scene seemed to drop by 10 decibels. The officers near the front entrance stepped back, parting like the Red Sea. A man walked through the shattered entrance. He didn't duck under the yellow police tape. A seasoned detective literally lifted it for him. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke charcoal overcoat that absorbed the harsh, flashing lights. His face was a study in aristocratic cruelty. High cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and eyes as cold and unforgiving as the steel of a gun barrel. He possessed an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. He didn't look like a grieving father rushing to a crime scene. He looked like a king assessing a battlefield. This was Silas Russo. Even Harper, who avoided the local news, recognized the face. He was the CEO of Russo Logistics on paper, but the streets knew him as the undisputed architect of the city's underground. "Daddy?" Lily broke free from the paramedics and ran across to the glass-strewn floor. Silas dropped to one knee, the expensive fabric of his coat soaking in a puddle of spilled coffee and blood. He caught his daughter burying his face in her hair. For a fraction of a second, the icy mask slipped, revealing a desperate, fierce relief. A heavy-set detective approached Silas. "Mr. Russo, we're securing the perimeter. The Castellano crew." "Not now, detective," Silas said, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that carried easily across the room. It wasn't a request. The detective immediately backed down, nodding nervously. Silas stood lifting Lily into his arms. He whispered something into her ear, and Lily pointed directly at Harper. Silas turned. His gaze locked onto Harper, and for a moment, she forgot how to breathe. He walked toward her, the sound of his leather shoes crunching on broken glass echoing loudly. His eyes tracked over her, taking in her cheap, blood-soaked uniform, her messy hair plastered to her forehead with sweat and the fresh bandage on her shoulder. "You're the waitress," he stated. It wasn't a question. Yes," Harper croaked. "You pulled her down." "I just did what anyone would do." Silas's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "Most people run. You bled for blood that isn't yours." He paused, his gaze dropping to her plastic name tag, which was cracked down the middle. Harper. He didn't offer a thank you. He didn't offer a reward. He simply stared at her, as if committing every detail of her face to his eidetic memory. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked out of the diner, flanked by a half-dozen heavily armed men who had quietly materialized in the shadows. The police let Harper go 2 hours later. They barely took a statement, their questions rushed and perfunctory. It was abundantly clear to Harper that this was a Russo matter now, and the CPD wanted nothing to do with it. Harper refused the ambulance ride to the hospital, knowing she couldn't afford the exorbitant bill. Instead, she walked the 3 miles back to Logan Square in the freezing rain, her shoulder throbbing with a dull, sickening rhythm. She was alive. But as she trudged up the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, she felt a lingering heavy shadow pressing down on her, the ghost of Silas Russo's steel-eyed stare. The eviction notice was taped securely to Harper's door, mocking her in the dim hallway light. She stared at it for a long moment, the water from her soaked coat dripping onto the threadbare carpet. Pay or quit in 72 hours. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. She had survived a mob shootout, only to be rendered homeless by Friday. She ripped the paper from the door, unlocked the deadbolt, and stepped into the freezing, dark apartment. The radiator clanked uselessly in the corner. Harper stripped off her ruined clothes, cleaned her wound, with rubbing alcohol hissing as the pain spiked, and wrapped herself in 2 heavy blankets on her sagging mattress. She stared at the cracked ceiling, her mind replaying the deafening roar of the guns, the metallic smell of blood, and the terrifying calm of Silas Russo. Sleep was impossible. At 3:15 a.m., 3 sharp, heavy knocks rattled her apartment door. Harper bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. The loan sharks. The landlord. Or worse, the men in the SUV coming to finish off witnesses. She crept to the door, peering through the peephole. Standing in the poorly lit hallway were two men in immaculate black suits. They didn't look like bill collectors. They looked like the men who stood behind Silas Russo. "Miss Evans," one of them said, his voice calm and polite. "We know you're awake. Please open the door." Harper swallowed hard, her hand trembling on the deadbolt. She had nowhere to run. She unlocked the door, keeping the chain engaged, and cracked it open. "What do you want?" "My name is Leo," the man said, offering a curt nod. "Mr. Russo requests your presence." "It's 3 in the morning," Harper said, her voice shaking. "I've already given my statement to the police. I don't know anything." "This isn't about the police, Miss Evans," Leo replied smoothly. "And it isn't a request you can decline. Please, a car is waiting." 10 minutes later, Harper was sitting in the back of an armored Maybach, wearing her only decent pair of jeans and a thick, oversized sweater that hid her bandages. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows as they drove north, leaving the gritty streets of Chicago behind for the sprawling, heavily wooded estates of Lake Forest. The car passed through immense wrought-iron gates, crunching over a sweeping gravel driveway until it parked in front of a massive stone mansion that looked more like a modern fortress. Harper was escorted inside by Leo, led through cavernous, silent hallways lined with expensive art until they reached heavy mahogany double doors. Leo opened the doors and gestured for her to enter. It was a vast library, the walls lined with thousands of books. A fire crackled in the massive hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. Standing by the window, pouring amber liquid into a crystal tumbler, was Silas Russo. He had changed into a dark turtleneck and slacks, but the aura of danger around him was only magnified in the intimate setting. "Sit, Harper," Silas said, not looking at her as he replaced the crystal stopper on the decanter. Harper didn't move. "Why am I here?" Silas turned, walking slowly to a large leather armchair. He sat crossing one leg over the other and gestured to the chair opposite him. The sheer gravity of his presence forced Harper's legs to comply. She sank into the soft leather feeling, entirely out of her depth. "Lily is asleep." Silas began, his voice devoid of the earlier adrenaline, replacing it with a cold, terrifying calm. "She hasn't spoken a word since I pulled her from that diner. Except to ask for you." Harper's chest tightened. "Is she okay?" Silas ignored the question, picking up a manila folder from the small table beside him. He opened it. Harper Evans, 24. No criminal record. Mother died 2 years ago. Father absent since birth. You work 2 jobs, yet you are $84,000 in medical debt. You missed your last 3 rent payments. You have an eviction notice on your door, and your bank account currently holds $42.16. Harper felt a hot flush of humiliation and anger wash over her. Did you bring me here to mock me, or just to prove you can hack a bank? Silas's eyes locked onto hers, and the faint hint of a smirk played at the corner of his mouth. He appreciated the fire. I brought you here to offer you a job. Harper frowned, confused. A job doing what? Serving coffee to your capos. Protecting my daughter, Silas said softly. The words hung heavy in the air. She had a bodyguard, Harper pointed out, a shiver running down her spine as she remembered the man bleeding out on the table. He was a professional, I'm a waitress." "Thomas was one of my best men," Silas agreed, taking a slow sip of his drink. And yet the Castellano family knew exactly where he and Lily were going to be tonight. A diner off the grid, unscheduled, unlogged. Only 3 people in my organization knew Thomas's route. Which means I have a rat in my house. He leaned forward, placing his glass on the table, the ice clinking sharply in the quiet room. "I cannot trust my men. I cannot trust my security team. I cannot trust the police, half of whom are on my payroll, and the other half on Castellano's. The only person in this entire city I know I can trust with my daughter's life is the woman who threw herself in front of an automatic rifle to save it." Harper stared at him, her mind spinning. "You want me to be a human shield. I want you to be her shadow," Silas corrected. "You will live in this house. You will accompany her everywhere. You will be her nanny, her companion, and her guardian. In public, you are simply the help. In private, you are my eyes and ears. I don't know anything about guns or fighting or I have men for the violence." Silas interrupted. "I need you for the loyalty. Lily trusts you. That is a commodity I cannot buy." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black smartphone, sliding it across the table toward her. "What's this?" Harper asked. "Log into your banking app," Silas ordered quietly. Harper hesitated, then picked up the phone. She navigated to her bank's website and typed in her credentials. The screen loaded. Her breath caught in her throat. Her balance was no longer $42. It was $500,000. "Your debt is erased. Your landlord has been bought out and fired. This is your signing bonus," Silas said, his voice dropping to a hypnotic, dangerous purr. "You will make $10,000 a week. You will have access to the best doctors, the best food, the safest walls in the country. You will never have to worry about a bill, a cold apartment, or a graveyard shift ever again." Harper's hands shook so badly she had to put the phone down. It was more money than she could comprehend. It was freedom. It was salvation. But as she looked up into Silas Russo's dark, fathomless eyes, she realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't giving her freedom. He was purchasing her soul. "And if I say no?" she whispered. Silas leaned back, the shadows of the firelight dancing across his face like a demon in the dark. "People who witness what you witnessed tonight, Harper, and refuse the protection of my family. They rarely survive the week. The Castellanos know you saved her. They will consider you an enemy. I am not offering you a choice. I am offering you a lifeline. Take it." Harper looked at the phone. She thought of the cold apartment, the eviction, the crushing, endless weight of poverty. Then she thought of Lily's terrified grey eyes. Slowly, Harper reached out and picked up the phone. "When do I start?" she asked. Silas Russo smiled. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing. "You already have." The transition from a freezing, mice-infested apartment in Logan Square to the sprawling, impenetrable fortress of the Russo estate in Lake Forest was a psychological whiplash Harper barely had time to process. Within 24 hours, her entire existence was dismantled and rebuilt. Her cheap, threadbare clothes were replaced with a curated wardrobe of tailored slacks, cashmere sweaters, and sensible Silent-soled shoes. Garments chosen not for fashion, but for mobility and discretion. She was given a suite adjacent to Lily's bedroom. It was larger than her entire old apartment, featuring a marble bathroom and a balcony overlooking the meticulously manicured high-walled gardens. Yet despite the luxury, the reality of her situation was unmistakable. It was a beautifully decorated panic room. Security cameras tracked every hallway. Men with earpieces and discreetly bulging jackets patrolled the perimeter. The Russo estate was at war. For the first 4 days, Lily did not speak a word. The vibrant, coloring book-loving girl from Mickey's Diner had retreated entirely into a shell of severe trauma. She refused to eat the meals prepared by the private chef, refused to let the maids draw her bath, and absolutely refused to let her father out of her sight unless Harper was in the room. Harper became the anchor. She slept in a chair beside Lily's 4-poster bed, holding the girl's small hand through the night terrors that left them both drenched in cold sweat. She coaxed Lily into eating by making her the same cheap burnt butter grilled cheese sandwiches she used to make for herself on double shifts. Slowly, the ice began to thaw. Mr. Russo watched all of this from the periphery, an omnipresent phantom in his own home. He was a man composed entirely of sharp edges and guarded calculations. He spent his days in the West Wing library, running a multi-million-dollar logistics empire that served as the legitimate front for his underworld operations. But his eyes were always on Harper. On the 5th evening, Harper was reading a battered copy of The Secret Garden to Lily. The little girl finally succumbed to an exhausted, dreamless sleep, her breathing evening out against the plush pillows. Harper gently marked the page, turned off the bedside lamp, and slipped out of the room. When she stepped into the dimly lit corridor, she nearly collided with a solid wall of muscle and wool. It was Russo. He stood perfectly still, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her pulse jump. "She's asleep," Harper whispered instinctively, stepping back to maintain a professional distance. "I saw on the monitors," Russo replied, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the quiet hall. He gestured down the corridor. "Walk with me, Harper." It was a command masked as an invitation. Harper fell into step beside him as they navigated the labyrinthine halls of the mansion. The silence between them was heavy, thick with the unspoken violence of the world she had been dragged into. "You have a remarkable effect on her," Russo observed, pausing before a massive bay window that looked out over the stormy waters of Lake Michigan. "Dr. Aris at Rush University Medical Center, the best pediatric trauma specialist in the state, told me it could take months for her to vocalize again. You managed it in under a week with a grilled cheese sandwich. She didn't need a doctor, Mr. Russo. She just needed to know the bad things couldn't reach her," Harper said quietly. Russo turned his head, his gaze piercing. "And you believe they can't? I believe you wouldn't let them." A dark, cynical amusement flickered in his eyes. "You place a lot of faith in a man you know is a criminal, Harper. The Castellano family, the men who shot up that diner, they don't care about collateral damage. They want my territory, and they want my life. They targeted Lily to break me." "Who told them where she was?" Harper asked the question, slipping out before she could filter her audacity. "You said there was a rat. Have you found them?" Russo's expression hardened into a mask of pure, terrifying ice. "Not yet. My inner circle is small. Vincent, my underboss. Leo, my head of security. And Arthur, my financial director. One of them sold my daughter's itinerary to the Castellanos." He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "Which brings me to you." Harper's stomach dropped. "Me? You possess a highly unusual set of instincts for a waitress," Russo stated, leaning closer. The scent of expensive cologne tobacco and danger washed over her. "When the glass shattered, you didn't freeze. You didn't run for the exit. You correctly identified the safest structural point in the room, executed a tactical drag on a moving target, and shielded her vitals with your own body. That is not luck, Harper. That is muscle memory." I just reacted," Harper stammered, a sudden, inexplicable cold sweat breaking out across her palms. "I ran a deeper background check on you," Russo continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Beyond the medical debt and the dead mother. I looked for your father, the one who supposedly abandoned you before birth." Harper crossed her arms defensively. "My mother never spoke of him. His name isn't even on my birth certificate. He was a nobody." Russo stared at her for a long, suffocating moment. "There are no nobodies in this world, Harper. Only people hiding in plain sight. I want you to attend a meeting with me tomorrow night at the Drake Hotel. A neutral ground, sit down with the Castellano associates. You will stand by my side." "I'm supposed to protect Lily," she protested. "Lily will be in the vault room with Leo." Russo said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I need my most loyal asset in the room with my enemies. I need to see if the wolves recognize the scent of one of their own." The Gold Coast room at the Drake Hotel was a monument to old-world opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, glittering light over intricate gold leaf molding and heavy velvet drapes. It was the kind of room where legitimate fortunes were made, but tonight it was rented under a shell corporation for the sole purpose of mediating a blood feud. Harper stood perfectly still, positioned 2 paces behind Russo's right shoulder. She wore a tailored black suit that made her look sharp, imposing, and entirely out of her element. Beneath the blazer, a lightweight Kevlar vest pressed uncomfortably against her ribs, a non-negotiable requirement from Russo. Across the long mahogany dining table sat Lorenzo Castellano, the ruthless patriarch of the rival syndicate. He was an older man, his face weathered like beaten leather, surrounded by 4 massive enforcers. On Russo's side stood Vincent, the slick, nervous underboss, and Arthur, the stoic financial director. The air in the room was toxic, thick with unspoken threats and centuries of old country grudges. "The diner was a mistake, Russo," Lorenzo rasped, leaning forward and resting his hands on the table. His voice was like grinding stones. "My men were given bad intel. They were told you would be there. We do not target children." "Your men unloaded 60 rounds into a public establishment, Lorenzo," Russo replied smoothly. His hands steepled calmly in front of him. "A mistake is a wrong turn. What your men did was an act of war, and my daughter was caught in the crossfire. And yet she survived." Lorenzo countered, his dark eyes, shifting past Russo to land directly on Harper. The old man's gaze sharpened, narrowing as he scrutinized her face. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "Thanks to a civilian, or so the police report claims." Harper felt the weight of Lorenzo's stare like a physical blow, but she forced herself to keep her chin high and her expression blank. Lorenzo suddenly stood up, leaning over the table, ignoring Russo entirely. He pointed a trembling, calloused finger directly at Harper. "Who is this girl?" "My security," Russo answered, coldly shifting his posture to block Lorenzo's view of her. "Security!" Lorenzo barked a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Do not play games with me, Russo. I know those eyes. I know that jawline. I fought beside that ghost 30 years ago in Palermo." Lorenzo's face twisted into a mask of pure shock and burgeoning fury. "That is not a civilian. That is a Moretti." The name struck the room like a live grenade. Vincent gasped, taking a step back. Arthur's hand instinctively drifted toward his jacket. Even Russo, the master of absolute control, stiffened slightly, turning his head to look at Harper. Harper's mind raced, her heart hammering against her ribs. Moretti. The name meant nothing to her. but the sheer terror it evoked in the men surrounding her was unmistakable. "You lie, Lorenzo," Vincent stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. The Moretti bloodline was wiped out in the Chicago Purge of '98. Victor Moretti died in the river. "They never found Victor's body," Lorenzo roared, slamming his fist onto the table. "Look at her! Look at the structure of her face." Victor disappeared a year before the Purge because he fell in love with a civilian woman. A nurse. Harper's breath hitched. Her mother had been a registered nurse. The puzzle pieces violently clicked into place. The missing father. Her mother's absolute paranoia, her refusal to ever put Harper's picture online, the constant moving from city to city when Harper was a child. The visceral, deeply ingrained situational awareness that had allowed her to survive the diner shootout. She wasn't just a poor waitress drowning in medical debt. She was the hidden heir to the most legendary, feared enforcer the American Mafia had ever seen. A man known as the Reaper of Chicago. If she is a Moretti, Lorenzo hissed, his eyes wide with a sudden vicious realization, then she has no allegiance to you, Russo. The Morettis bow to no one. Before Russo could respond, chaos erupted. It didn't come from the Castellanos across the table. It came from within. Vincent Russo's trusted underboss suddenly drew a silenced pistol from his waistband, but he didn't aim it at Lorenzo. He leveled the barrel directly at the back of Russo's head. "I'm sorry, boss," Vincent sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "But the Castellanos offered me the entire South Side, and I can't let a Moretti walk out of this room alive." Everything happened in a fraction of a second. Harper didn't think. The ancient dormant blood of her father took over. She lunged, not away from the gunfire, but directly toward it. Harper grabbed the heavy silver water pitcher resting on the table and swung it with brutal, terrifying precision, smashing it directly into Vincent's wrist just as the gun discharged. The silenced shot went wild, burying itself into the ornate plaster ceiling. Vincent screamed, dropping the weapon as his wrist shattered. Russo reacted instantly. He spun his own weapon, clearing his holster with blinding speed, and put 2 rounds into Vincent's chest. The traitor collapsed to the thick carpeting dead before he hit the ground. The Castellano enforcers drew their weapons, but Lorenzo raised a hand, stopping them instantly. The old man was staring at Harper, his chest heaving, awe warring with fear in his eyes. Harper stood over Vincent's body, the heavy silver pitcher still gripped tightly in her hand. Her breathing ragged. She didn't look terrified. She looked furious. The posture of the exhausted, beaten-down waitress was entirely gone, replaced by a hold-imposing dominance that mirrored the very men she was standing among. Russo slowly lowered his weapon, his chest heaving as he turned to look at the woman who had just saved his life for the 2nd time in a week. The revelation of her bloodline fundamentally shifted the tectonic plates of their world. She was no longer just his employee. She was royalty. "The sit-down is over, Lorenzo," Russo said, his voice deadly quiet, his eyes never leaving Harper. "You have your answer. The rat is dead, and the Moretti heir." He stepped closer to Harper, the dangerous unspoken tension between them igniting into an undeniable inferno. "Belongs to the Russo family now." The armored Maybach tore through the neon-lit arteries of the city, slicing through the midnight fog rolling off Lake Michigan. Inside the spacious cabin, the silence was no longer the oppressive quiet of a captive and her powerful captor. It was a heavy electric stillness, the kind that precedes a catastrophic storm. Harper sat in the plush leather seat, her hands resting on her knees. The knuckles were bruised, the skin scraped from where the heavy silver pitcher had connected with Vincent's bone. She stared at her own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. For 24 years, those hands had poured cheap coffee-scrubbed linoleum floors and clutched past-due medical bills. Tonight, they had shattered a Mafia underboss's wrist with the precision of a trained killer. Russo sat across from her, his piercing gaze tracking every micro-expression on her face. The gun that had ended Vincent's life was now resting casually on his thigh, a brutal reminder of the world she had just fully inherited. Victor Moretti. Harper finally whispered the syllables, feeling foreign and heavy on her tongue. She looked up, her eyes locking onto Russo's. "You knew the name. You recognized it before Lorenzo even said it. Who was he?" Russo poured a measure of scotch from the car's built-in crystal decanter, offering it to her. When she shook her head, he took a slow sip, his jaw ticking. The Chicago syndicate wasn't always ruled by the Russos and the Castellanos. He began, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly tenor. 30 years ago, there was a third faction, the Morettis. They didn't deal in extortion or gambling. They were the enforcement arm of the National Commission, the executioners. Your father, Victor, was their crown prince. The streets called him the Reaper. He was a phantom, a master tactician who could dismantle entire criminal empires overnight. He was feared by everyone, including my own father. Harper's chest tightened. If he was so powerful, what happened to him? He disappeared, Russo stated flatly. Rumor had it he fell for a civilian, a woman who worked the graveyard shift at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. He tried to walk away from the life to protect her. In this world, you do not get to walk away. The commission ordered a purge in 1998. The Morettis were hunted down. Victor's car was found submerged in the Chicago River, riddled with bullets. But no body was ever recovered, and neither was the woman. Harper closed her eyes, a sharp ache radiating behind her temples. The puzzle pieces of her fractured childhood were violently locking into place. The constant frantic relocations every few months, her mother's absolute terror of law enforcement, the strict unyielding rule against ever having her photograph taken. Her mother hadn't been a neglectful parent fleeing bad debts. She had been a survivor desperately hiding the last remaining drop of the Moretti bloodline from a syndicate that wanted it extinguished. "My mother saved me," Harper murmured. "She hid me in plain sight, at the bottom of the food chain." "She made you invisible," Russo corrected gently, the harsh edges of his tone softening for the first time since she had met him. "But blood like yours cannot be diluted by poverty, Harper. Lorenzo recognized your bone structure, but I recognized your instincts the moment the glass shattered in that diner. You moved like a ghost. You moved like Victor." The Maybach passed through the heavy wrought-iron gates of the Russo estate, crunching to a halt on the gravel driveway. The heavily armed perimeter guards immediately flanked the vehicle, their flashlights cutting through the dark. Before the driver could open the door, Russo leaned forward, invading Harper's space. The scent of gunpowder, expensive scotch, and raw masculine dominance enveloped her. "Lorenzo Castellano knows who you are now," Russo warned, his dark eyes burning with a fierce, possessive intensity. "He will not rest until you are either under his control or buried in the ground. The Moretti name commands a terrifying loyalty among the old world enforcers. If he captures you, he will use your bloodline to legitimize a hostile takeover of the entire Midwest." "I am not a pawn," Harper said, her voice startlingly steady. The terrified waitress was dead. The Reaper's daughter was awake. Russo's mouth curved into a slow, dangerous smile. No, you are a queen without a throne. But as long as you are under my roof, you share mine. The shift in their dynamic was instantaneous and irreversible. Harper was no longer the hired help. She was a strategic partner, a vital asset, and an undeniable equal. Over the next 48 hours, the estate transformed into a war room. Harper refused to hide in her suite. She demanded full access to the security schematics, the financial ledgers, and the personnel files. Russo granted it without hesitation. He watched with a mixture of awe and dark fascination as Harper effortlessly digested decades of criminal logistics. Her mind, previously used to mentally tracking 50 diner orders at once, proved to be a razor-sharp tactical instrument. She purged the staff. Using her innate understanding of desperation and body language, Harper identified 2 more maids and a groundskeeper who had been quietly accepting bribes from the Castellano crew. They were swiftly removed from the property. More importantly, Harper fortified Lily's emotional defenses. She didn't treat the 6-year-old like fragile glass. Instead, Harper sat with Lily in the opulent gardens, teaching the little girl how to observe the world. She taught her how to identify the exits in any room, how to read the tension in a bodyguard's shoulders, and how to stay perfectly silent. Lily absorbed the lessons with the solemn gravity of a child born into war, her terrifying muteness slowly evolving into a watchful, intelligent quiet. On the 3rd evening, the fragile peace of the estate was shattered by a secure, encrypted phone call. Harper was standing in the library alongside Russo, tracing the routes of heavily armored private Garda World transport trucks that the Russos used to move untraceable cash when Russo's private line blinked red. He answered it on speaker. "Russo!" Lorenzo Castellano's gravelly voice echoed through the room, laced with a sickeningly triumphant sneer. "I am a reasonable man. Reasonable. I do not wish to burn Chicago to the ground. I have a proposition." Russo leaned over the mahogany desk. "You tried to execute me in a Hotel Lorenzo. We are well past propositions. I did not order Vincent to pull the trigger." Lorenzo lied smoothly. "That was the ambition of a greedy underboss. My war is with you, Russo, not with the ghost of Victor Moretti. Put the girl on the line." Russo's jaw clenched. He looked at Harper, offering her the choice. Harper stepped forward, her posture rigid, and leaned toward the microphone. "I am listening," Harper said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "Ah, the little reaper." Lorenzo chuckled a dry, rattling sound. "Your father was a legend. It is a tragedy you grew up scrubbing floors when you were born to wear silk. I offer you a restoration of your legacy. Walk out of the Russo estate tonight. Come to my compound. I will formally recognize the Moretti bloodline in front of the commission. You will have half the city infinite wealth and the respect you were denied. Stay with Russo, and you will burn with him." Harper didn't blink. She looked across the desk at Russo. She saw the ruthless syndicate boss who had dragged her into the dark, but she also saw the fiercely protective father who had wept holding his daughter on a blood-soaked diner floor. She saw the man who had erased her mother's crushing medical debt without asking for a receipt. "My father walked away from the commission to protect his family," Harper said, her voice cutting through the speaker like a blade of ice. "I am staying to protect mine. If you come for this house, Lorenzo, you will learn exactly why they called him the Reaper." She reached forward and disconnected the call. The silence in the library was deafening. Russo stared at her, the dark fire in his eyes burning hotter than ever before. He rounded the heavy mahogany desk with slow, deliberate strides until he stood mere inches from her. He reached up his large, calloused hand, gently gripping her jaw, tilting her face up to meet his intense gaze. "You just declared war on the most heavily armed syndicate in the country," Russo murmured, his thumb tracing the sharp line of her cheekbone. "For me, for Lily. I declared war for us," Harper corrected, her heart hammering against her ribs, not out of fear, but out of a wild, unbridled adrenaline. Russo leaned down his lips, brushing against hers in a kiss that was brutal, desperate, and possessive. It was a sealing of a blood pact. The poor waitress was gone forever, replaced by the matriarch of a newly forged empire. "Then let them come," Russo whispered fiercely against her mouth. "We will bury them all." The Castellano strike came not under the cover of a quiet suburban night, but in the chaotic subterranean belly of Chicago itself. Russo and Harper were transporting Lily to a highly secure private underground bunker beneath a shell corporation building in the Loop, escorted by a convoy of 3 black reinforced SUVs. They were navigating the claustrophobic concrete labyrinth of Lower Wacker Drive, a bleak, shadowy thoroughfare that ran beneath the city's glittering skyscrapers, notorious for dead zones in radio communication and GPS tracking. Harper sat in the back of the heavily armored center vehicle, Lily tucked securely between her and Russo. The little girl clutched the battered coloring book from the diner, her steel-gray eyes darting nervously at the flickering fluorescent lights passing overhead. "We are 3 minutes out," Russo stated, checking the heavy tactical watch on his wrist. Suddenly, the lead SUV slammed on its brakes with a violent shriek of burning rubber. A massive industrial garbage truck had violently jackknifed across all 3 lanes of Lower Wacker Drive, completely blocking the tunnel. Before the Russo driver could throw the vehicle into reverse, a heavily modified armored transport van bearing stolen Constelli's private military decals roared out of a side service tunnel, slamming into the rear SUV and effectively boxing them in. "Ambush!" the driver screamed over the intercom. The concrete tunnel erupted into a deafening war zone. Heavy automatic gunfire rained down from the catwalks above the armor-piercing rounds, sparking violently against the bulletproof glass of the Maybach. "Get her down!" Russo roared, drawing a submachine gun from a concealed compartment beneath his seat. Harper didn't hesitate. She threw herself over Lily, pressing the child firmly onto the floorboards, shielding her entirely with her Kevlar-vested torso. The muscle memory of the diner shootout returned, but this time it wasn't accompanied by paralyzing fear. It was fueled by a cold, lethal clarity. Russo kicked open his door, using the reinforced steel of the vehicle frame as a shield as he returned fire, his weapon roaring in the confined space. His security detail poured out of the front and rear vehicles engaging the Castellano mercenaries in a brutal close-quarters firefight. But there were too many of them. Lorenzo had emptied his entire treasury to hire rogue military contractors. The Russo men were highly trained, but they were vastly outnumbered. Harper peeked over the edge of the leather seat. She saw Russo pinned behind the engine block, taking heavy fire from a sniper positioned on a maintenance gantry directly above them. The angle was impossible. Russo couldn't get a shot off without exposing himself entirely. The Moretti blood sang in her veins. It was a terrifying, undeniable instinct for violence and survival. "Lily, close your eyes and cover your ears," Harper commanded smoothly. The little girl instantly obeyed, burying her face into her knees. Harper unclipped a heavy, specialized tactical smoke grenade from Russo's discarded tactical bag on the seat. She pulled the pin. Instead of throwing it at the enemy, she cracked the passenger side door and rolled the canister directly under their own vehicle. Thick, blinding white smoke instantly billowed outward, engulfing the Maybach and Rousseau's position in an impenetrable cloud. The enemy gunfire faltered for a crucial 2 seconds, the mercenaries losing their visual targets. Harper used the cover of the smoke. She slipped out of the vehicle, staying agonizingly low to the filthy concrete. She didn't have a gun, but she didn't need one. She needed the environment. She crawled rapidly toward the abandoned garbage truck, blocking their path, slipping entirely under the radar of the elevated shooters who were blindly firing into the smoke cloud. She reached the cab of the garbage truck. The Castellano driver was dead shot through the windshield by Rousseau's men in the opening volley. Harper hauled herself into the cab, her hands flying over the massive, complex pneumatic controls. She didn't know how to drive a rig this size, but she understood leverage. She slammed her fist onto the hydraulic release override. With an ear-splitting mechanical groan, the massive rear compactor of the garbage truck disengaged. The heavy steel tailgate swung violently open, releasing tons of compacted waste and debris directly onto the street below, crushing the scaffolding that held the Castellano sniper and creating a massive chaotic barricade that cut the mercenary forces in half. The structural collapse caused a chain reaction. A ruptured water main in the ceiling burst, raining a torrential downpour into the tunnel, further obscuring visibility, and plunging the scene into absolute chaos. Rousseau saw the tactical shift instantly. With the sniper eliminated and the enemy forces divided by the debris, he rallied his remaining men. They surged forward, executing a flawless, ruthless counter-offensive. Within 4 minutes, the gunfire ceased. The only sounds remaining in the flooded, smoking tunnel were the hiss of hot engines and the groans of the dying. Harper climbed down from the truck cab, her clothes soaked from the ruptured water main, her face streaked with soot and grease. She walked through the wreckage, her posture radiating an terrifying, undeniable authority. The surviving Rousseau men parted for her, looking at the former waitress with absolute reverent awe. She hadn't fired a single shot yet. She had single-handedly broken a military-grade ambush. Rousseau stood by the Maybach, his chest heaving, his suit ruined. When he saw Harper emerging from the smoke, uninjured and victorious, he dropped his weapon. He crossed the flooded asphalt in 3 massive strides, pulling her into a crushing, desperate embrace. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. His hands frantically checking her shoulders, her back, her face. "I'm fine," Harper breathed, resting her forehead against his chest, listening to the frantic, powerful beating of his heart. "Where is Lily?" Rousseau stepped back, opening the rear door of the Maybach. Lily was sitting up on the floorboards, her hands covering her ears, completely unharmed. When she saw Harper, she scrambled out of the car, launching herself into Harper's arms. "You did it," Lily whispered into Harper's wet shoulder. "You beat the monsters." Harper squeezed her eyes shut, holding the child tightly. "Yes, baby. The monsters are gone." The defeat on Lower Wacker Drive broke the back of the Castellano syndicate. Lorenzo Castellano, humiliated and stripped of his mercenary army, was forced to flee the city that very night. He was found a week later in a motel in Gary, Indiana, having suffered a highly suspicious fatal heart attack. The commission did not investigate. The underworld of the Midwest was irrevocably changed. 6 months later, the neon sign of Mickey's Diner was replaced with the sleek, frosted glass facade of an upscale Italian bistro. Harper Evans never returned to Logan Square. She never looked at another past-due bill. She stood on the grand balcony of the Lake Forest estate, wearing a breathtaking gown of midnight blue silk, sipping a glass of rare vintage champagne. Below her, the gardens were filled with the city's elite politicians, judges, and the high-ranking capos of the newly unified syndicate. They were all there to celebrate the wedding of the decade. Russo stepped onto the balcony behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. The undisputed king of the city had finally found his queen. "They are waiting for you," Russo murmured, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "The entire city wants to pay their respects to the new matriarch." Harper smiled, leaning back into his solid warmth. She looked out over the high stone walls of the estate, thinking of the terrified, exhausted girl she had been just 6 months ago. The waitress who shielded a child had died on that bloody diner floor. But the woman who rose from the shattered glass was something far more dangerous. She was Harper Moretti Russo, and she ruled the shadows.